In ancient Rome, religion was never just a matter of faith. It was a pillar of political order, a tool of social discipline, and a reflection of state authority. Every officially recognized cult existed under the watchful eye of the Senate. Rituals were regulated, priests were supervised, belief itself was expected to serve stability. That is precisely why the Bacchanalia terrified Rome. What began as a religious cult devoted to Bacchus, god of wine, ecstasy, and transformation slowly evolved into something the Roman elite could neither fully understand nor control. Unlike traditional Roman rituals, the Bacchanalia were not rigid, public, or predictable. They took place at night. They involved music, intoxication, emotional release, and a sense of collective freedom deeply unsettling to a society built on discipline and hierarchy. Even more alarming was who participated. Women, slaves, freedmen, and young men groups, usually excluded from political and religious authority, found a space within the cult where status dissolved. For the Roman Senate, this was not simply religious diversity. It was a threat to the very architecture of power. In 186 BCE, Rome struck back. The Senate issued one of the most severe religious decrees in its history, the Senatus Consultum de Bacch. Officially, the decree aimed to suppress moral corruption and restore order. In reality, it dismantled the Bacchic cult almost entirely. All unauthorized rituals were forbidden. Any remaining ceremonies required explicit state approval, had to occur during daylight, under the supervision of magistrates, and with a severely limited number of participants. In other words, Rome stripped the cult of its essence. No night, no trance, no collective ecstasy, no freedom. The immediate effect was fear. The population understood that the state was willing to use extreme force to preserve its authority. Executions followed. Arrests multiplied. Informants were rewarded. The cult was framed as a massive conspiracy and underground network capable of destabilizing the Republic itself. But a question lingers. Even today, were the Bacchanalia truly a danger to Rome? Or did the Senate use fear as a pretext to reassert control at a moment of political vulnerability? Modern historians propose several explanations. Some argue that Roman elites feared foreign influence. The Bacchic cult had Greek origins, and Rome had a long history of mistrusting external religious movements. Others suggest that the cult offered a social freedom incompatible with Roman values, an environment where emotions overruled discipline, where hierarchy dissolved, where individuals escaped traditional roles. Another interpretation cuts even deeper. The Bacchanalia challenged who held authority over bodies, gatherings, and belief. What Rome could not regulate, it destroyed. This episode reveals a fundamental truth about Roman power. The Republic prided itself on law and institutions, but when challenged, it relied just as heavily on state violence. The repression of the Bacchanalia was not simply a religious act, it was a political message engraved in blood. And after the repression came something just as powerful as force: the control of narrative. Rome understood that violence alone was not enough. The memory of the event had to be shaped, justified, sanitized. Centuries later, the historian Livy would write about the Bacchanalia in dramatic terms, describing uncontrolled orgies, moral decay, manipulation, and chaos. His account, written under Augustus, reflects not only historical events, but the political ideology of his time. By portraying the cult as depraved and dangerous, the narrative reinforced the legitimacy of repression and the necessity of moral order. This was no accident. The Senate promoted a simple story. The Bacchanalia were not an innocent religious movement. They were a threat to the Republic. Three themes dominated this official narrative. First, moral corruption, by emphasizing excess, sexuality, and intoxication. Roman elites created a sharp contrast between their own discipline, control, and the chaos attributed to the cult. Second, political subversion. The cult was portrayed as a secret organization capable of mobilizing thousands. Whether this was true remains uncertain, but exaggeration served political interests perfectly. Third, manipulation of the masses. Bacchic priests and priestesses were depicted as dangerous figures, capable of influencing crowds through music, emotion, and altered states of consciousness. In a political culture obsessed with controlling public behavior, This was unacceptable. Through this narrative, the Bacchanalia became more than a cult. They became a warning. The repression of the Bacchanalia did not end with arrests and executions. Its true impact unfolded afterward, in the laws that followed and the habits that slowly reshaped Roman society. What Rome had crushed was not only a cult, but a way of practicing belief outside state supervision, and the Senate had learned a lesson it would never forget. From this moment on, religion in Rome became inseparable from surveillance. The Sinatas Consultum de Bacchanalibus established a legal precedent that went far beyond any religious gathering not explicitly authorized by the state became a potential crime. Nighttime rituals, private assemblies, ecstatic practices, and foreign traditions all fell under suspicion. Faith was no longer something one lived. It was something one had to justify. This shift marked a turning point. Rome had always absorbed foreign gods, but now it demanded obedience in exchange. Belief could exist only if it submitted to Roman order. The Bacchanalia became the model case, not because they were uniquely dangerous, but because they demonstrated how quickly a religious movement could escape elite control. The Senate understood that collective emotion, shared secrecy, and spiritual equality were powerful forces. Left unchecked, they could erode hierarchy, challenge patriarchy, and weaken political authority. Women stood at the center of this anxiety. The Bacchic cult had offered women an unprecedented space of autonomy. They could lead ceremonies, initiate others, and act without male guardianship. In the rigid structure of the Roman Republic, this was deeply unsettling. Religion had briefly allowed women to exist outside the family and the state. The repression closed that space abruptly. After 186 BCE, female religious agency was systematically reduced. Women were pushed back into roles defined by fathers, husbands, and magistrates. The Bacchanalia thus became a warning about what happens when women step beyond assigned boundaries. Spiritual freedom was reframed as moral danger. The consequences reached far beyond religion. Social life itself became regulated. Private gatherings were monitored. Slaves and freedmen were watched more closely. Informants multiplied. Rome developed a culture of suspicion that would later be used to manage political conspiracies, slave revolts, and popular movements. Fear became a tool of governance. Citizens learned that participation in the wrong gathering at the wrong time with the wrong people could lead to ruin. Silence became safer than curiosity. Obedience replaced experimentation. What the Senate could not control, it discouraged through intimidation. Yet repression did not erase Bacchus. The god remained part of the Roman pantheon, but in a transformed state. Bacchus was no longer the god of ecstatic liberation. He became a civilized figure, stripped of his disruptive potential. His festivals were sanitized, his symbolism moderated, his worship reshaped to fit Roman ideals of order and restraint. This strategy reveals something crucial about Roman power. Rome did not always destroy what it feared. Often, it absorbed and reshaped it. By controlling Bacchus, the state neutralized his threat and turned him into an instrument of legitimacy. The literary legacy of the Bacchanalia reflects this transformation. When Livy wrote about the scandals centuries later, he inherited a narrative already shaped by senatorial propaganda. His descriptions emphasize excess, immorality, and chaos. Bacchic rituals appear as uncontrolled orgies rather than structured religious practices. This portrayal served a political purpose. Under Augustus, Rome promoted a return to moral order. The story of the Bacchanalia became a historical example used to justify strict authority. By presenting the Republic as vulnerable to moral collapse, the narrative legitimized centralized control. History became ideology. Modern historians approach these sources with caution. Scholars like Meribeard and others have shown that the official version likely exaggerates the danger. The Bacchanalia were probably not a conspiracy, but a socially diverse religious network that crossed boundaries Rome preferred to keep intact. Men and women, free and enslaved, Roman and foreign, such mixing was far more threatening than any ritual excess. What Rome punished was not depravity, but unpredictability. The Senate feared what it could not categorize, regulate, or command. The Bacchanalia revealed cracks in the Roman system spaces, where people gathered beyond surveillance, where emotions overruled discipline, where authority dissolved temporarily. The repression restored order, but at a cost. Religion became safer, but also poorer. Spiritual life lost its spontaneity. Fear replaced devotion, and a precedent was set: when belief challenges power, power responds with force and narrative control. In the next part, we will examine how this strategy shaped Rome's treatment of later Sibylle and others, and how the Bacchanalia became a permanent warning etched into Roman memory. The repression of the Bacchanalia did not remain an isolated episode. It became a template, a model Rome would reuse whenever belief, identity, or collective emotion escaped political control. From this moment forward, religion was no longer judged solely on devotion, but on obedience. The Senate had discovered something essential: fear could regulate belief more effectively than force alone. In the decades that followed, Rome faced an influx of foreign cults from Egypt, Asia Minor, and the Eastern Mediterranean. These religions offered emotional intensity, personal salvation, and intimate rituals, qualities deeply appealing to populations excluded from power. Once again, the state reacted with suspicion. The cult of Isis provides the clearest example. Despite its popularity, it was repeatedly banned, dismantled, and reinstated depending on political needs. Temples were destroyed, priests expied, and rituals prohibited only to be restored when expedient. The lesson of the Bacchanalia guided these decisions. Rome no longer asked whether a god existed. It asked whether that god could be controlled. Night rituals were the first target. Private assemblies came next. Charismatic leaders followed. Anything that fostered loyalty outside state authority became dangerous. This policy reshaped Roman religious life. Cults learned to adapt or disappear. They modified rituals, reduced secrecy, and adopted Roman aesthetics to survive. Mysticism became performance. Ecstasy became ceremony. What could not be domesticated was suppressed. But the most enduring consequence of the Bacchanalian repression lay not in theology, it lay in social control. The Senate had framed the cult as morally corrupt, politically subversive, and emotionally manipulative. This triad would reappear repeatedly in Roman history. Accusations of excess, conspiracy, and influence over the masses became standard tools to neutralize perceived threats. Political rivals were accused of corruption. Popular leaders were accused of manipulation. Movements outside elite oversight were accused of secrecy. The Bacchanalia taught Rome how to turn fear into legitimacy. Women continued to bear the heaviest burden of this legacy. The memory of female autonomy within the Bacchic rites lingered as a warning. Female religious authority became increasingly restricted. Public virtue demanded modesty, silence, and submission. A woman acting independently spiritually or socially was now more easily framed as dangerous. Religion had briefly opened a door. Politics slammed it shut. The repression also altered how Romans related to one another. Trust eroded. Informants multiplied. Private life became political. Citizens learned to monitor themselves and others. This culture of suspicion would later be used to manage slave uprisings, political conspiracies, and social unrest. What began as religious repression evolved into a governing philosophy. The Bacchanalia thus occupy a paradoxical place in Roman memory. Official narratives portray them as proof of the Republic is immoral behavior. But beneath that surface lies something more revealing. A society anxious about its own fragility. Rome feared disorder, not because it was weak, but because it understood how thin the line between order and chaos truly was. The cult of Bacchus represented everything Rome struggled to contain. Emotion, transformation, equality, loss of hierarchy. These were not crimes, but they were incompatible with a system built on control. And so the state responded, as states often do when confronted with uncertainty. It simplified, it exaggerated, it punished, it rewrote the story. By turning the Bacchanalia into a symbol of excess and danger, Rome transformed a complex religious movement into a cautionary tale. History became a weapon. Memory became policy. Even centuries later, the shadow of this repression lingered. Roman authors continued to reference the Bacchanalia as an example of what happens when discipline collapses. The narrative survived long after the fear that created it. Modern historians now recognize this pattern. The crisis was as much imagined as real. The rites were likely no more dangerous than other cults tolerated by Rome. What made them intolerable was their structure: inclusive, emotional, decentralized, and beyond elite supervision. Fear created the enemy. Power justified the response. The story of the Bacchanalia does not end with decrees, arrests, or rewritten rituals. Its true conclusion lies in what it reveals about Rome and about power itself. The repression of the Bacchanalia was not simply a reaction to a cult. It was a moment when the Roman state openly declared that collective freedom would never be allowed to exist beyond its control. Religion, emotion, identity, and the body itself were acceptable only when disciplined, supervised, and useful to authority. Rome did not fear Bacchus because of wine or celebration. It feared what happened when people gathered without permission. The Bacchanalia represented a space where hierarchy dissolved, where women spoke and acted without male guardians, where slaves stood beside free citizens, where emotion replaced discipline, where identity was fluid rather than fixed. In a republic built on order, lineage, and control, this was intolerable. So Rome responded in the only way it knew how: by criminalizing freedom and moralizing repression. What followed was not merely the suppression of a cult, but the establishment of a political reflex that would define Roman governance for centuries. Whenever a movement appeared that operated outside elite oversight, Rome would react with the same tools: fear, law, spectacle, and narrative control. The Bacchanalia were not destroyed because they were immoral. They were destroyed because they were unmanageable. This realization forces modern historians to reconsider the official story preserved in Roman literature. Livy's dramatic descriptions of excess and depravity were not neutral accounts. They were inherited from a senatorial tradition that needed justification. Violence requires legitimacy, and legitimacy requires a story. Rome rewrote the Bacchanalia as chaos, so that repression could appear as salvation. This is why the episode matters far beyond its historical context. It exposes a mechanism that repeats across civilizations when institutions feel threatened. They rarely admit fear. Instead, they frame resistance as corruption, difference as danger, and freedom as decay. The Senate claimed to defend Roman values, discipline, family, order, but in doing so, it revealed something uncomfortable. Those values were fragile enough to require force to survive. The legacy of the Bacchanalia also reshaped the role of women in Roman society. The brief spiritual autonomy they experienced within the cult became a cautionary memory. From that point forward, female independence, religious or social, was more tightly regulated. The state reinforced the idea that women's bodies and voices required supervision. Freedom had shown itself possible. That alone made it dangerous. Social trust suffered as well. The culture of denunciation encouraged during the repression did not disappear. It became a permanent feature of Roman life. Citizens learned to watch one another. Private gatherings became suspect. Silence became safety. Obedience became virtue. Religion, once a space for collective meaning, became an extension of the state. And yet, Bacchus survived. Not as a force of liberation, but as a controlled symbol. Rome did not erase the god. It reshaped him. Bacchus was allowed to exist only in forms stripped of his disruptive power. These strategies, absorb, sanitize, repurpose, became a hallmark of Roman dominance. What Rome could not destroy, it transformed. Modern scholarship paints a far more nuanced picture than ancient propaganda. Researchers now agree that the Bacchanalia were likely not a conspiracy, nor a moral collapse. They were a social network too inclusive, too emotionally intense, and too decentralized for an elite-driven republic to tolerate. The crisis was not created by the rites. It was created by fear. And fear, once unleashed, reshaped law, religion, gender roles, and social behavior. The Bacchanalia remind us that history is not written only by events, but by reactions, by who controls the narrative after the violence ends. Rome understood this deeply. By framing the cult as a threat, it ensured that future generations would remember repression as necessity. But beneath the official memory lies another truth. The Bacchanalia revealed a society deeply anxious about freedom, a state that equated control with stability, an elite that believed order justified domination, and a political system willing to sacrifice diversity, expression, and autonomy to preserve its authority. This is why the story endures. Not because of scandal, not because of excess, but because it exposes the eternal tension between power and freedom. The Bacchanalia were a mirror. Rome chose to smash it, then rewrite its reflection. And in doing so, it left us one of the darkest lessons of history. When belief becomes political, freedom becomes dangerous.